She embarked on a journey of love and adventure, capturing moments of joy and freedom, but behind the lens, shadows loomed. Gabby Petito, a 22-year-old with a spirit for exploration, set out on a cross-country trip with her fiancé, Brian Laundrie. Their journey was documented meticulously, each post reflecting a seemingly perfect life. But as the miles unfolded, so did the cracks in their facade. A concerned witness reported seeing Brian acting erratically, describing him as acting like a lunatic and allegedly slapping Gabby. A call was made to 911. The dispatcher listened as a panicked voice described the scene unfolding before them. "We drove by, and the gentleman was slapping the girl." Officers intervened, documenting the incident, yet no charges were filed. Gabby and Brian were separated for the night, a brief pause in their tumultuous journey. Weeks later, Gabby's family lost contact with her. Their concern grew as days turned into an agonizing silence. The headlines began to spread. "Missing Gabby Petito." Her family pleaded for answers, but Brian wasn't talking. And then, Brian came back home, alone. As the search for Gabby intensified, authorities discovered her remains in Wyoming's Bridger-Teton National Forest. The coroner confirmed her death as a homicide by manual strangulation. Brian Laundrie became a person of interest, and then a fugitive. His sudden disappearance sparked a nationwide manhunt, leaving everyone asking the same question: where is Brian? Then, weeks later, the search ended. His body was found in the Carlton Reserve in Florida, and next to him, a notebook. Inside, the confession that shocked the world. Brian wrote, "I ended her life. I thought it was merciful, that it is what she wanted, but I see now all the mistakes I made. I panicked. I was in shock." The words offered closure to some, but for many they only raised more questions. Was it really an act of mercy, or was it a final attempt to control the narrative? Their story, once filled with promise, serves as a stark reminder of the unseen battles some face. If this story moved you, if you believe Gabby's story should never be forgotten, hit that like button, comment your thoughts, and subscribe. More untold crime stories coming soon. Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie, young, adventurous, and seemingly in love. They had everything people dream of: the open road, breathtaking landscapes, and each other. But as they documented their journey for the world to see, behind the camera, something much darker was unfolding. Friends and family saw the smiles in the photos, the perfectly curated travel vlogs, the affectionate captions, but they also saw the cracks. They knew things were far from perfect. Gabby's closest friends described her relationship with Brian as intense, but not in the way love should be. Brian was controlling, manipulative in ways that weren't obvious at first. Gabby had a free spirit, a deep desire to explore the world, to share her adventures with others. Brian, he wanted control, dominance. He hated when things weren't done his way. Gabby's parents recalled the small changes first. She texted less. She called home less often. She second-guessed herself more. And then there were the bruises. During their cross-country trip, things started unraveling fast. The dream of van life, a romanticized road trip filled with adventure and spontaneity, was no longer a dream. It was suffocating. The couple had spent months confined in a small van, tensions rising, arguments escalating, and then a bystander saw it happen. A man called 911, his voice urgent, filled with concern. He described a disturbing sight. Brian was hitting Gabby. "We just drove by, and the gentleman was slapping the girl. They ran up and down the sidewalk, and he continued to hit her." The police arrived. Their body cams recorded what should have been a moment of truth. But instead of portraying an abused young woman crying out for help, the footage showed Gabby taking the blame. She was crying, panicking, apologizing. She blamed herself for Brian's aggression, a textbook sign of emotional manipulation and abuse. Brian, calm and collected, played the victim. He charmed the officers, joked with them, even smiled. Gabby, on the other hand, couldn't stop shaking. Her eyes darted around as if searching for an escape, but she had none. The officers separated them for the night, but no arrests were made. No charges were filed, and just days later, Gabby would be fighting for her life. The last messages sent from Gabby's phone were strange, unlike her. Cold, mechanical. Her mother, Nicole Schmidt, received a text that simply read, "No service in Yosemite." But Gabby was never in Yosemite. In fact, she wasn't anywhere at all because by then, she was already gone. Brian returned home alone. He parked their van in his parents' driveway, walked into the house, and acted as if nothing had happened. Gabby's family pleaded for answers, but Brian, he stayed silent. And then, he disappeared. August 12, 2021, Gabby is pulled over by police. She looks fragile, broken. She takes all the blame, trying to protect Brian, but deep inside, she knows she's in danger. In the days following, Gabby continued to text her mom. She shared small details, tried to keep things normal, but something was off. Nicole, her mother, would later recall that the messages didn't sound like Gabby. There was something missing, something forced. Then came the last conversation. Gabby's mother still remembers it vividly. Gabby had been crying. Her voice was shaky. She mentioned how bad things had been, how Brian was losing it more frequently, how she didn't know what to do. And then, silence. Days passed and no one could reach Gabby. Calls went unanswered. Texts were left unread. And Brian had returned home alone. The search for Gabby intensified. Friends, family, and strangers across the country joined in. Social media exploded with hashtags, #FindGabby. But as the days stretched on, hope began to dwindle. Then, on September 19th, deep in Wyoming's Bridger-Teton National Forest, they found her. Gabby's body lay in a secluded area, abandoned. The cause of death? Manual strangulation. The coroner confirmed she had been left there for weeks. The stars above were the only witnesses that night. No one knows her exact final words. But we know this: Gabby didn't leave Wyoming alive. Her body was discovered near a campsite that Brian and Gabby had visited earlier. Investigators pieced together a timeline. They found disturbing entries in Brian's notebook, dark thoughts, excuses, regrets. But the one phrase that stood out most: "I thought it was merciful, that it is what she wanted, but I see now all the mistakes I made." It wasn't mercy, it wasn't love, it was control. One last act of dominance. And then, just like that, Brian vanished. For weeks, the world searched for him. Law enforcement combed through swamps, forests, and abandoned trails. His parents remained tight-lipped, their behavior suspicious. And then, finally, a breakthrough. Brian's remains were found in the Carlton Reserve, Florida. A self-inflicted gunshot wound ended his life. Next to him, a confession. Gabby's story became more than a tragedy. It became a movement, a plea for awareness, a reminder that love should never come with fear, that control is not love, that manipulation is not devotion. Her voice was silenced that night in Wyoming, but today it echoes through those who refuse to forget. Brian drove Gabby's van back home, alone. He had dinner with his family. He went on walks, but deep inside, he knew. He knew what he had done. He knew what was coming, but he refused to face it. For weeks, Brian's parents remained silent. They didn't speak to the media. They didn't speak to Gabby's grieving family. Instead, they acted as if nothing had happened. Did they know all along? Were they helping Brian hide? Then, investigators uncovered something chilling, a letter from Brian's mother, labeled "Burn After Reading." What did it say? What secrets did it hold? As the pressure mounted, Brian made one last desperate move. He ran. He disappeared into the Florida swamps, evading law enforcement. But he wasn't just running from the police. He was running from his own demons. For weeks, the search continued. Then, the discovery. Brian's remains found in the thick, murky waters of the Carlton Reserve, a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His notebook, soaked and damaged, but still holding the final words of a man who could no longer escape his own guilt. And in these cold, dark waters, Brian took his final breath. And then, the confession. The last words of a killer. For weeks, the world demanded answers. What really happened that night in Wyoming? Was it an accident, as Brian would later claim, or was it something far more sinister? The truth was buried in his final letter. The pages were damp, smudged with water damage, but the words, they were clear, chilling, irrevocable. A glimpse into the mind of a man who had taken everything from Gabby Petito and then, in his final moments, attempted to justify it. The letter began with an admission: "I ended her life." But instead of remorse, Brian's words dripped with rationalization, an unsettling attempt to convince the world, and maybe even himself, that what he had done was an act of mercy. He described Gabby as injured, claimed that she was in unbearable pain, and that he had no choice. But was that true? Was Gabby suffering from an accident, stranded in the wilderness, as Brian suggested? Or was this just another lie? Another manipulation from a man who had controlled her in life and now sought to control the narrative in death? Investigators, forensic experts, and psychologists analyzed Brian's letter. They dissected every word, every sentence and hints, searching for hidden meanings. One thing stood out. He never once called it murder. He never once admitted to hurting Gabby out of rage. Instead, he painted himself as a tragic figure, a grieving lover who had to put her out of her misery. But there was one problem. The autopsy report told a very different story. Gabby wasn't left alone in the wilderness, injured beyond help. As Brian claimed, she had been strangled, manual strangulation, by someone's bare hands. This wasn't a moment of mercy. This wasn't an act of compassion. This was control, a slow, violent, intimate crime committed by someone who wanted to dominate her until her very last breath. Brian's letter continued. He wrote about regret, about how he couldn't live without her, how he didn't know how to go on. And then, the final lines. The last words he ever wrote before he turned the gun on himself. Quote from the letter, "I thought it was merciful, but now I see it was just cruel." Even in death, Brian had a story to tell, but the truth? It was written in blood. And as his parents read those final words, as the investigators closed the case, one question remained unanswered. Was this really an act of regret? Or was this Brian's final manipulation, one last attempt to control the way the world saw him? Because Gabby never got to tell her side of the story, and now she never would. Gabby's story didn't end in Wyoming. Her voice echoes in every woman who has ever felt trapped, every person who has ever been afraid to leave, every soul who has ever thought, maybe this time things will be different. But for Gabby, there was no next time, no second chance. Her future was stolen, her dreams cut short, and for her family, the pain will never fade. She was just a kid, a beautiful, loving soul. We just want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Gabby's parents didn't let their daughter become just another statistic. They turned their grief into a mission, one that would shake the world. The fight for justice, Gabby's parents demanded answers, pushed for changes in the law. The creation of new legislation, Gabby's Law, aimed at improving responses to domestic violence cases, holding those accountable, not just Brian, but the systems that failed to protect her. The #JusticeForGabby movement. Millions of people across the world came together, sharing Gabby's story. Domestic violence survivors speaking out, breaking their silence. A global wake-up call, recognizing the warning signs before it's too late. But this isn't just about Gabby. This is about every person who has ever been afraid to leave, every victim who thought they had no way out. And right now, someone is watching this, who needs to hear this message. If you or someone you love is in danger, please reach out. There are people who will listen, people who will help. No one deserves to live in fear, and no one should ever have to suffer alone. Gabby is gone, but her story still speaks, and it's up to us to listen. If this story moved you, if you believe Gabby's story should never be forgotten, hit that like button, comment your thoughts, and subscribe, because more untold crime stories are coming soon. Every like helps keep Gabby's memory alive and spreads awareness about the dangers of domestic violence. Your comment matters. Share your thoughts, your emotions, and if you or someone you know has ever been in a similar situation, your words could help others find the courage to speak up. By subscribing, you're not just following another true crime channel. You're becoming part of a community that refuses to let these stories be forgotten. A community that believes justice should never be out of reach. Together, we can make sure that victims are heard, that their stories don't just become cold cases, but lessons that can save lives. Gabby's story is one of tragedy, but also one of change. The world heard her name. Let's make sure it's never silenced. Thank you for watching the Untold Crime Chronicles. Stay safe, stay aware, and always remember, your voice matters.